Hello and welcome to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past week of coverage on Monocle Radio, with highlights from our studios here in Midori House and from around the world. This week, we meet the director of a new documentary focused on the life of the late Palestinian photojournalist Fatima Hassouna.
My angle was to get the most of her feelings, of how she felt, how she survived, how she documented the war.
Plus, not man from Mars, but meteorites. We'll explore who owns what when objects from outer space land on our planet.
Meteorite hunters go to Morocco, they go to Oman, they go to places in the Sahara because you have that black rock against the white sand. And you buy a permit from the Geological Survey of the country and then you tell them, oh, I found this.
All that and much more in the next hour, here on The Curator with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. We begin this week's show with the latest installment of What We Learned. Here is Monocle's contributing editor, Andrew Muller.
We learned this week of discombobulation at large among American conservatives as they struggle to adjust to the new online manner of California Governor Gavin Newsom, whose official press office accounts have taken to posting demented all-caps philippics such as the ensuing, as read by Monocle's Incoherent Ravings desk chief, Fernando Augusto Pacheco.
Trump just fled the podium with Putin. No questions, nothing. Total low energy. The man looked like he'd just eaten 3 buckets of KFC with Vlad. Is he afraid the press will ask about me? America's favorite governor?
Anyway, we learned that the proverbially upstanding people of America would simply not stand for this bellicose nonsense, and we learned this from ruggedly impartial Fox News arbiter Sean Hannity.
A new, performative, confrontational style. Maybe it wins you points with the loony radical base in your party, but America is not going to vote for that record.
Imagine someone ascending to high office in the United States with a performative confrontational style winning points with the loony radical base in their party. Ridiculous. Could never happen.
Don't take your guns to town, son. Leave your guns at home, Bill.
Anyway, we learned that though the current US administration professes to be perfectly relaxed about armed citizens swaggering through the streets of American cities toting artillery, that sane countries think long and hard about issuing to train soldiers, some lines are not to be crossed.
We are following new details about the man arrested for reportedly throwing a sandwich at law enforcement in Northwest D.C.
Yes, we learned that a suspect stood accused of assailing D.C. police, not with a pistol, a shotgun, an automatic rifle, or even a grenade launcher, but a sandwich. Actually, you remember that clip we did of everyone pretending to be aghast about former MP Will Quince resigning as minister for whatever it was, which we have since repurposed a few times, with someone just saying whatever the thing is over every mention of Will Quince? Let's have that, but with sandwich.
No,
sandwich.
Surely not.
Well, sandwich.
This changes everything.
Sandwich.
This changes everything.
What are we going to do?
Surely not.
Very good. I think we may consider the gravity of the situation appropriately conveyed.
I think so.
We learned that certainly American media and government alike were determined to react to this as if it was basically Pearl Harbor multiplied by the assassination of President Kennedy, as details emerged about the suspect and the sinister forces of which he may or may not be an agent.
He was an employee of the Department of Justice. He was an attorney in the criminal division of the DOJ. Attorney General Pam Bondi saying he's been relieved of those duties, saying in part in a statement, quote, "This is an example of the deep state we have been up against for 7 months."
From which we learned that President Donald Trump's campaign to expunge the deep state is making considerable progress if the deep state is down to flinging Subway wraps at the cops. But we learned that Attorney General Pam Bondi was resolute in her determination to to protect DC's thin blue line, grimly declaring thus, as will now be read by Monocle's Grim Declarations desk chief, Monica Lillis.
If you touch any law enforcement officer, we will come after you.
Unless, obviously...
Newly sworn-in President Trump issued roughly 1,500 pardons on his first day in office and commuted the sentences of 14 of his supporters in connection with the January 6th insurrection.
You beat the cops unconscious with fixtures and fittings torn from the Capitol building, in which case, fine. We nevertheless learned that charges had been filed against the alleged sandwich hurler, though not, perhaps disappointingly...
Oh no.
Assault with a deli weapon. Hey, thanks for coming out. Elsewhere. You ain't nothing but a hound dog. Specifically, the Czech Republic, we learned that Andrej Babiš, leader of front-running party ANO in the Czech Republic's current general election campaign, has taken his admiration for US President Donald Trump to new heights, or depending on one's perspective, new depths. The two men already had much in common: wealthy businessmen before entering politics, rowdy populist demagogues, not massively keen on foreigners, routinely accused of various non-legal shenanigans, weirdly fond of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Let's have some generic Central European folk music, atmosphere, and that. Maybe a bit easier on the accordions? Better. We learned that Trump and Babiš now share the quirk of having a prominent lieutenant with apparently murderous designs upon dogs. The Czech remake of US Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, and by her own account of having once shot a misbehaving family pet, no dog, am I right, being ANO MP Margita Balashtikova. We learned via leaked recordings that she had not only schemed to destroy her former spouse's business in an expression of jilted fury, and who among us, etc., but had discussed hiring someone to kill her ex-husband's new girlfriend's dog. Well, quite. Our lawyers tell us we have to make it clear that she denies everything. All right, settle down, Lionel. We did learn it is important to note that said pooch is by all accounts, and despite the nefarious designs of said MP, alive and well. And we learned of one key difference between Babiš and Trump, i.e. that Babiš is more concerned about the dog lover vote than his American analogue. We learned that Babiš had not only undertaken a veritable blitz of canine outreach, which left no Czech mutt safe from a pat on the head from the aspirant Prime Minister, but that Margita Balashtikova had been dropped from the party's candidates list. Yes, she has been hounded from office. Boo! For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Next up, we turn to Monday's edition of The Globalist. Who owns the stars, or indeed the planets and the bits that land on us? Last month, a 25-kilogram meteorite from Mars was sold at auction in New York for $5 million. The object was discovered 2 years ago, not in New York, but in Niger by a professional meteorite hunter. To explore how it came to pop up at auction, Monocle's Emma Nelson was joined in the studio by Tira Schubert, Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and Ambassador for the Science Museum.
I have a little bit of space for you to touch and see. A bit of the early solar system is right in front of you right now.
Which is astonishing. This is radio, though, so this isn't easy. Can you bring us... So it looks like a beautiful but jet black pebble that you brought in.
It's about the same size as a cashew nut, and if you pick it up, you'll find it's much... Please pick it up.
Thank you so much.
It's much heavier than you would imagine it to be, because it's 95% iron and about 5% nickel, a bit of cobalt and phosphorus and sulfur thrown in there.
Where's it from?
And it's from Siberia. It came from a famous meteorite fall in 1947, and we know about it because it crashed down 23 tons of material, which is big. It was in the middle of Siberia, though, in 1947.
Good job, really, 23 tons.
And,
where had it fallen
it
from?
Had fallen. It wasn't from Mars. And it made a smoke tail of 23 kilometers. And the sound of the impact was heard 300 kilometers away. And a local artist, I've given you a stamp that was issued in the Soviet Union in commemoration. A local artist, Mr. P.J. Medvedov, was at his window seeing it come down. So he drew a painting of it, a long tail of smoke coming from the heavens. But we often don't see meteorites. They fall on the Earth. Several tons a day fall on the Earth. And that means thousands of tons a year fall on the Earth. They're usually from the asteroid belt.
How often does 25 kilos in one piece land on the Earth? Because that's what's happened in Niger.
Niger, well, not very often do we find them, because 7/10 of Earth is oceans, and most of them fall into the ocean. And this is even more unusual because, A, it's so big, because usually the mass burns up and you have 10 tiny little pebbles like the one that we have in front of us, the size of a peanut. But this came from Mars, and there's only about 400 meteorites we know that came from Mars on Earth. So a big asteroid in the asteroid belt came bouncing around and hit Mars, and a chunk of Mars then was knocked off and then launched into space and eventually landed on Earth.
And then it landed in a New York auction house, which is where all the big problems of... What you have compared, what you've just described there, is comparatively simple to what's actually happening with the arguments about who owns that thing, who's allowed to sell it, who's allowed to buy it.
Well, this is very unknown territory in most places, and let's give it its proper name, its romantic name of NW16788. Well, NW, I think we can call it that because we seem familiar with it, somehow appeared in Italy first. By even the Italian Space Agency had it on display, and the government in Niger was aware of it. But I think it was the price tag of over $5 million in Sotheby's that got their attention, because other countries that have meteorites easy to find, I'm talking about countries with deserts, meteorite hunters go to Morocco, they go to Oman, they go to places in the Sahara, because you have that black rock that we've looked at here against the white sand, and you buy a permit from the Geological Survey of the country, and then you tell them, I found this. You don't have to do that when you go to Antarctica, which is an even better place to find meteorites. But Niger doesn't have a system like that, and they're very cross about that. So they've started an investigation.
They want it back, don't they?
I think not necessarily. They might want it back, or they might want a share of the money. But it is a valuable thing, and we have actually sent one back to Mars. We've sent a chunk of a Mars meteorite from London back to Mars. The Natural History Museum has about 20 of them, and it sent it back on the Perseverance mission in 2020 to use a calibration point for some of the geological experiments on that.
Does that remove the element of human greed, which seems to be slightly dominant in this story?
Well, human greed, I don't think ever can be removed. And there is a hot market in meteorites out there. So if you want to, if you're tired of investing in Picassos and Jackson Pollocks, you can invest in some meteorites. Some of them costs are hefty prices, 5 figures.
And the fact is that different places have different laws determining what to do with these things when they land, don't they?
Yes, but I think that there's going to be a lot more countries looking at meteorite laws, so all you space lawyers out there, keep your eyes open.
Tira Schubert there, Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and Ambassador for the Science Museum, in conversation with Monocle's Emma Nelson earlier this week. You are listening to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Palestinian photojournalist Fatima Hassouna was 25 when she was killed by Israel, along with 6 members of her family. This was just days after a documentary about her life entitled Put Your Hand on Your Soul and Walk was announced at this year's Cannes Film Festival. The film's Iranian director, Sepideh Farsi, spoke to Monocle's Hassan Anderson about making the project entirely over video calls. Hassan began by asking Sepide what it was like to form a friendship with Fatima over a year as Israel's destruction of Gaza continued to worsen.
Well, I was more and more desperate, this decimation, as you call it, or the annihilation, the deliberate annihilation of Gaza by Israeli army and the killing and targeting of journalists, all the while blocking the non-Palestinian journalists from getting in there. It made me more determined about the fact that what I was doing was essential to getting something out that the world was missing. Of course, it's very presumptuous, perhaps, but I knew that Fatima was a very ordinary girl, but also a very special person, very talented, very adamant about documenting the genocide. And my angle was to get the most of her feelings of how she felt, how she survived, how she documented the war, and what does it mean to be under the bombs, And I have a little experience about that, being an Iranian who's lived a few years of war in Iran before I left, and also about being stuck in a country and not being able to leave. Also that, I know, and being, also in jail, so being stuck, basically. I know all of that a bit, so even if it's not comparable to what she was living, my experience was a little bit closer to hers than a European person's would have been,
I'd like to talk about Fatima's work as well. You show many of her photos in the film. They seem to embody that warmth and optimism despite the horrendous conditions that she finds herself in. And how would you describe her approach to photojournalism and beyond that, her life too?
I think she was transformed, I would say, by the war, by this war, because she had known other wars as a younger person and a child even. But this one was, I think, something particular. So her gaze was transformed from a photographer who would go for picturesque things, showing life and, the beauty of it in Gaza, which you can follow actually the change and the transformation on her Insta page, to someone who ended up, as she says it in the film, only documenting destruction and war, even though not in a very voyeuristic way, because she was very pudic in her approach. But still, there was only black, destruction, grey, no color. Yet she would go for life. She would pick things. She had this tenderness in her, alongside a very rigorous way of and systematic gaze, which I think was getting very acute as months were passing by. During that year, I have photographs done by her from December 2023 till December 24, and you see the development, the changing of her gaze and her method. And she would have been a great photographer had she continued.
Fatima was killed by an Israeli airstrike alongside 6 members of her family in April of this year, shortly after your documentary was announced as part of the independent film programme shown during the official Cannes Film Festival. You include a phone call with Fatima telling her of the news of Cannes in the film. How has the meaning of the film changed for you in the wake of her killing, and what do you hope people take from the film?
When she was targeted, a day after the announcement, a day after our last call, I first thought I would not change the film. I would not change at all. It took me a few weeks, and in the week that was preceding the premiere of the film, I decided to include that bit of our conversation, which is a very long conversation. I just put a few minutes of it for people to see her joy, her the hope. These, eyes getting bigger, like, oh, it's incredible, amazing. It's I every time I see that, there is the backlash, of course, but there is a moment when I even feel happy, even now, that she left with that joy, that she knew that the film was finished, that people were going to see it, that the world was going to see her and discover her work. And I this is a little relief for me there, and then of course I get hit by the wave. But the film is the same, and yet every bit of it has changed, because when I watch it, and I think everybody now, when we're watching the film, we know we have this knowledge inside our heads that she was killed by the Israeli army alongside her family. We know that. And yet she carries us away. It's very strange because it's dichotomic. So I have joy when I watch the film now, and I get that blow as well. But what I would like people to get away from it is her smile, her energy, her resilience, really.
That was Iranian director Sepideh Farsi in conversation with Monocle's Hassan Anderson. The film, Put Your Hand on Your Soul and Walk, is out in the cinemas in the UK now. Stay in the Middle East now. Israel was once regarded as a left-wing project. Now the country has grown more conservative, defensive, and some would argue extreme. Is a liberal Israel recoverable? And might that lead to peace? For a look at the evolution of international opinion of Israel, Monocle's Andrew Muller was joined on last weekend's edition of The Foreign Desk by Daniela Pallet, managing editor at the Institute for War and Peace Reporting.
Daniela, let's start at the start, by which I mean the start of the State of Israel in 1948. Is it right to say that, at least initially, international leftist opinion saw Israel as an essentially left-wing project?
I think that's true to say. And certainly the early Zionists saw themselves as part of this international left-wing socialist movement right at the beginning. I mean, many parts of the early Zionism, such as Hashomer Hatzair, which were very much part of the kibbutz movement, supported a binational state as opposed to a majority Jewish state. So it was definitely seen as part of the wider socialist movement. There were very strong ties with the Soviet Union as well. I mean, when Stalin died in 1953, it was widely mourned amongst many parts of Israeli society, even though he was clearly no friend to the Jewish community.
I mean, there's a narrative, I know, among conservative Israelis that this all changes, at least international opinion of Israel changes with the Six-Day War in 1967, and all of a sudden Israelis are seen as victors in war rather than victims of it. Is there anything to that, or had things started to shift before then?
I think there's certainly something to it. I mean, you can't divorce this from wider geopolitical issues. In 1967, Israel won a military victory over a number of allies of the Soviet Union. So that feeds into it as well. And before 1967, I mean, it's ironic now, considered that the accusations of Israel as a settler colonial state, but certainly many within Israel and the dominant labor movement then saw themselves as part of this worldwide independence movement. There were attempts at deep ties being built with the emergence of the post-colonial independent states in Africa, for instance, seen as part of that same movement. So that changed in 1967. And also the Palestinian liberation movements and resistance movements and ideological movements also changed as well, with emergence of new factions such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and a change in the idea of pan-Arabism as well. So I think it's very much part of the wider geopolitical setup, but also how politics changed both within Israel and amongst Palestinians as well as internationally.
Because the 1970s, I guess, do seem to be the key decade here. It's noticeable that as late, if you like, as 1973, in the UK, the opposition Labour Party were more supportive of Israel during the Yom Kippur War than Ted Heath's Tory government were. But it's in the years after that, the PLO, I guess, become more of a thing, and so does the idea that they are a liberation movement and Israel is something from which people need to be liberated. Why did so many European leftists, though, gravitate towards the PLO? Because among the extremes, like the Red Army faction / Baader Meinhof, etc., there was quite formal collaboration.
Well, I think there was certainly quite a romantic view of Israel and the Israeli left internationally. It was very fashionable once upon a time to go and volunteer on a kibbutz. The kibbutz was seen as the ultimate realization of socialist ideals, and so on. Certainly, there were a number of international alliances made with the more radical movements in Europe and elsewhere, attempts to organize and also to receive funding and support. And I think that we can see the roots of what we have now, where this is a much more partisan movement. I think that currently, Palestine is now seen as a much more left-wing issue rather than a right-wing issue. And it's become, in modern parlance, part of the culture wars, which is not how it was in the earlier years of the conflict.
I mean, this coincides with a certain amount of prominence for conservative parties within Israel after Israel's early decades were dominated by the Labour Party. Did those Israeli governments start to think, well, we have just lost the international left, they're not really our people anymore, and start adjusting their pitch accordingly, especially to conservatives and conservative Christians in the United States?
I think it's got an awful lot to do with internal Israeli politics and demographics as well. Until the late 1970s, Israeli politics was dominated by the left and by the socialist parties. And then there was a change where Likud came into prominence. But there was also a demographic element here, whereas Israelis from European countries, European and Ashkenazi heritage, were the dominant powers in politics and in the nascent state. And then towards the end of the 1970s, you had the Sephardi Jews, the Mizrahi Jews, who had been disadvantaged historically, and they came to political prominence and took a much more right-wing point of view, to put it very crudely. And I think within Israel, there is definite class element, which persists to this day, in the idea that the left are the middle class and the ones who are privileged, whether in terms of education or in terms of economics. That split, I think, influenced outreach towards other factions abroad too.
I mean, it's fair to say we have travelled a distance since Zionism was generally regarded as a left-wing cause. But does the condemnation of Israel from the international left, and this does date back a long way before October 7th, 2023, and Israel's response to it, does it register in Israeli politics at all?
I think it's quite relevant to ask, actually, where is the left within Israel? And does that resonate at all? I mean, it's virtually non-existent. The Labour Party, from being the dominant force, as we said, in Israeli politics, now has, I think, 4 seats. They just barely scraped in at the 2022 elections. So there isn't, the left in Israel has really been virtually destroyed. Even centrist left politics are unrecognisable to what we might have, how we might have considered them even a decade ago. Certainly, yes, BDS has a huge impact, and it has been exploited greatly by Netanyahu and officials, really to feed this idea that the world is against Israel, boycott, divestment, sanctions. They allege it's driven by anti-Semitism, just pure anti-Semitism. And it's very easy to make that argument because clearly it resonates. You know, the idea of Jewish businesses being boycotted in 1930s Germany, for instance, and that's really been exploited and actually has fed into and supported Netanyahu's narrative. And Netanyahu, by the way, is not the most extreme version of politics in his current government. So, yeah, the idea of these mass protests that have been seen in certainly in European capitals over recent months are viewed within Israel largely as an attack on the existence of Israel. There is very little nuance when it comes to how this is viewed. One could argue there's often a lack of nuance in the demonstrations as well, but this certainly feeds into this bunker mentality within Israel. And that, more than anything, supports the right-wing views that whatever Israel does, whatever actions it takes, the international community or certain sections of the international community will oppose it and malign it.
Daniela Pella there, managing editor at the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, speaking to Monocle's Andrew Muller there. Still to come here on The Curator, we hear how the renowned chef Mandy Yin's new book spreads the legacy of her home cuisine. We explore a coffee shop in Damascus, and we review some of the new words being entered into the Cambridge English Dictionary. Stay tuned.
We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Banking is our craft.
You are with The Curator, our weekly highlight show here on Monocle Radio, and I am Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Fortunes have been made in the world of cookbooks by promising short prep times and easy recipes. But for a chef like Malaysian-born Mandy Yin, who runs Sambal Shiok restaurant in London, backing an approachable version of her nation's cuisine isn't just about convenience. That's why she wrote her new book, Simply Malaysian, to make sure the food of her childhood continues to grow in popularity beyond Malaysia's borders. Not just in restaurants, but kitchens worldwide. In the process, she's also ensuring that heritage gets passed on to a new generation, starting with her own son. Here is Monocle's Chiara Rimella finding out more.
Being a working mom, juggling so many things of being a restaurateur, writer, doing other work as well as running the household and dealing with my kid. So now my cooking really has to be extremely efficient, very, very quick, and leaning into store-bought staples, as well as a few things that I like having around that I make myself, just to put in front of my very small family now as very tasty Malaysian dinners or lunches. Minimum fuss. This book has no snacks, no desserts, which is actually quite unusual. I'm all about getting food on the table ASAP.
How much does Malaysian food lend itself to being simple? Because I think that there is a misconception from people who perhaps are not used to cooking it that you do have to leave the rendang on for 20 million hours and this kind of things. But can you actually make Malaysian food simple?
100%. This is why I'm so excited that Simply Malaysian is out, because this is really how we eat at home. It's quite important to us actually, especially breakfast and lunch, to have something cooked and hot. So for lunchtime, we very commonly go to what we know as economy rice stalls or restaurants, where you're handed a plate of rice and there's like a selection of like 20, 30, 40, 50 different dishes. And this is a variety. You've got like vegetables, proteins, eggs, like everything, and a very fully balanced meal. So this book really is a snapshot of that, and indeed includes a lot of recipes that my mother/father have cooked for me throughout my life.
I want to take a step back because you kind of hinted there at your upbringing and then obviously now you live and work here in London. What are those memories that are conjured up by some of the dishes here? And maybe you can point us to a couple of dishes and just sort of take us back like a Proustian Madeleine to that moment that it kind of evokes for you.
So, for example, economy rice, like it's just got so many different dishes, as I mentioned, at least 20 dishes. Generally, we love our eggs. So, for example, there's an entire chapter on egg-centric dishes. For example, it sounds very simple, but so delicious. Fried eggs with bird's eye chilies and soy sauce. Like, honestly, you ask any Malaysian, we've all had that. Likewise, there's a recipe in there for sesame ginger chicken. Very straightforward, easy braise. It will be very, very familiar to Malaysians. And then you'll always have a vegetable dish. There's a really lovely dish, sambal, okra and aubergines. And it comes together in literally in as much time as it takes to cook your rice. So those three dishes, for example, that I mentioned just now, it's not only balancing flavours. So, for example, not all of them are extremely spicy. There's pops of chili, but the sesame ginger chicken is it has no chili at all. But then you get a pop of chili from the sambal with the okra and aubergine, or you'll dig into the egg. So in every mouthful with a bit of rice, you can have something different. And that's the joy of Malaysian cuisine. So that's sort of going down sort of economy rice, or sort of dishes with rice. But there's also so many beautiful noodle dishes and one-pot rice dishes, and actually veering into pasta in this book. So all Asians, Southeast Asians, will love or will be familiar with Indomie. It's an instant noodle, but honestly, we all have this packet at home. If you run out of that packet, I've developed the recipe, very, very simple one, to evoke that. And it's just very easily done because you just need some shallot oil to go. Yes, it takes time to make shallot oil boil, but it just sits there in your pantry for months, So just leaning into little useful store cupboard staples like that. And otherwise, sort of Hainanese chicken rice, you might be familiar with that. I've got a one-pot Hainanese chicken rice version, and it's just very, very simple, and that's how I have to cook, and I enjoy cooking now.
You mentioned your 3.5-year-old there. As somebody who has a child in a nation that is not where they were born themselves, how do you think, or how do you hope that your cooking is going to shape his memories?
It's so important to me that he understands a bit of his blood and where he's come from. So at the moment, I'm really, really trying to get back to Southeast Asia at least once a year or every 2 years, just so that he really comes to understand how important food is to Malaysians and our extended family. And actually, this book is dedicated to him, because I wish I had a book like this when I went off to uni and really started cooking for myself. So yeah, I do feel that he already has an amazing palate. He's very comfortable with eating, a bit of chili.
I was going to say, you feed him, you spoon feed him sambal.
No, very simply, for example, I don't cook anything differently for him. We will just have a curry, whatever it is, but I'll just take proteins or potatoes, whatever, out of it with plenty of rice, so at least he gets the flavors. I'm just aghast at a lot of my friends and peers who have young children, and they're like, they can't take any chili at all. I'm like, but you're Asian. What? I can't. That's just so anathema to me. I just can't understand that. So I hope that he will come to have a similar palate to myself.
That was Mandy Yin, author and restaurateur, speaking with Monocle's Chiara Rimella. Her book, Simply Malaysian, is out now. Next up, we turn to the latest installment of Tall Stories. How can meeting a friend for coffee serve as an act of cultural preservation? For cities that have gone through centuries of upheaval and change, historic meeting places offer a theater for stories to be shared and ultimately not forgotten. In this week's Tall Stories, Lian Syed took us to a cafe in Damascus, which serves up stories of the Syrian capital's past.
In the shadow of the great Umayyad mosque's ancient eastern gate sits a cafe that has witnessed the rise and fall of regimes and colonial powers. Al Nawara Cafe, though young compared to the 8th century mosque above it, remains one of the oldest coffee houses in the Middle East, its doors having welcomed guests for somewhere over 350 years. From the outside terrace, you'll see families and couples taking selfies with the mosque's impressive wooden gate, but step inside and you're immediately enveloped by the bubbling of shisha pipes and the gentle whirl of old ceiling fans that barely stir the heavy sweet-scented air. The aroma of Turkish coffee mingles with the apple tobacco as waiters dart between wooden chairs and simple tables, carrying glowing coals from the water pipes. The walls tell their own stories, a random collection of portraits, faded photographs of the Umayyad Mosque, and tapestries bearing Quranic verses that give the space its homely feeling. But it's the elevated chair, almost throne-like in its prominence, that draws every visitor's attention. This is the seat of the Hakwati, the traditional storyteller whose voice has carried through Damascus' darkest nights and brightest days. Here, dressed in traditional attire, the Hakwati takes his place each evening, sword in hand, transforming ancient tales into living theatre. His voice rises and falls as he becomes each character, his blade flashing during tales of war and conquest. Before television screens, the Hakwati was the evening's entertainment, but more than that, he was the keeper of collective memory. His stories of love, loss and betrayal and redemption weren't mere diversions. They were lessons wrapped in narrative, particularly vital in a land that has known occupation, revolution and civil war. Today, as Damascus slowly emerges from one of its darkest periods, the weight of the Haqati's role feels heavier than ever. The initial euphoria of change has given way to the harsh realities of rebuilding a fractured nation. The recent bombing of the Mar Elias Church sent shockwaves through the city's Christian quarter, a reminder that Syria's path forward remains fraught with danger. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, Al Nawara Cafe serves more than a gathering place. It's a sanctuary where ancient wisdom meets modern anxieties. The stories told from that elevated chair carry new resonance when recounted to audiences who have lived through their own tales of survival and loss. Al Nawara Cafe has survived Ottoman rule, French colonial administration, independence, coups, wars and revolution. Its walls have absorbed the conversations of merchants and rebels, poets and politicians, ordinary citizens seeking solace in ritual and story. The cafe's persistence through Syria's tumultuous history speaks to something deeper than an ordinary establishment. It represents the enduring power of community and narrative to sustain people through the darkest chapters of their collective experience. As Damascus writes its next chapter, Al Nawara remains what has always been, a place where the past informs the present, where stories carry the weight of wisdom, and where the simple act of gathering over coffee and tales becomes an act of cultural preservation. As Damascus slowly pieces itself back together, the Haqati's voice persists, conveying to those who listen that every chapter's end births a new story, and that some traditions are too valuable to let slip away.
Lee and Syed there for this week's edition of Tall Stories. Sticking with the coffee theme now for a highlight from my show The Stack, where last weekend I welcomed to the studio the team behind celebrated coffee magazine Standard. The title is a celebration of coffee culture around the world and is distributed quarterly to the doorsteps of more than 11,000 readers worldwide. Issue 39 is just out, and to tell me more, I was joined by Standard's founder Michal Mokan and editor-in-chief Luke Adams.
I guess the fundamental vision of the editorial structure is to become this perfect personification of your favorite cafe, what I mentioned earlier. So if you imagine like walking to Monocle Cafe right off the street, you see the baristas, you see the like people behind the machine preparing the coffee. You might see the names of the producers on the coffee bags. So you have the human element of it. Then you see the machines themselves, so the technicalities, the grinders and all the geeky stuff. So you have that level of it. Then you obviously have the beverage itself, so the coffee that like the baristas are making, the people are drinking. Then you have the guests, and the guests could be coffee fanatics, but they could be musicians, could be teachers, could be doctors, really anyone. But then you also have magazines on the shelves. You have artwork on the wall. You can listen to music inside of the cafe. So this cafe environment has all of these different layers that are stacked on top of each other. And the editorial idea of Standard since the beginning was to encapsulate all of these layers in a beautiful publication and bring it to every quarter.
Look, give us a taster of issue 39. I did say something about espresso martini. I love that piece. But tell us more about some of the pieces in the issue.
It's one of those things I always need to refamiliarize myself with the latest issue because I'm already working on the next one. So it's kind of a little bit behind.
And how often it comes out again?
Quarterly.
Quarterly, yeah.
It comes out every quarter. So yes, what do we have here? Well, obviously, I'm a fan of espresso martinis too and most other drinks.
Good taste. So you have good taste.
That was a story about the history of coffee cocktails written by, one of our long-term contributors, Noah Berger, anthropologist, sort of sociologist, working out of Paris, I think, but she does travel around. I think that's one of the ways in which we have to approach the subject of coffee is trying to use coffee more as an avenue by which to explore something else, something beyond it. Because we're almost 40 issues in. If you were just focusing on coffee, that's a very tough editorial position to put yourself in because there's only so much you can write about varieties and farming and the taste of coffee. So we try to, I think maybe it has to do with my background and preferences in reading generally, which are mostly literary, travel writing, maybe essays, So I like to have this element of coffee lead to something that's perhaps unexpected. Again, going back to the experience of the coffee shop, the most enjoyable part of being in a coffee shop to me is not just the fantastic tasting coffee or speaking about the grinder or the latest espresso machine with the barista, although I do that too, it's part of my job, or the aroma. It's really these chance conversations that you can have with somebody who might be a historian or somebody who might be an expert in ancient Greek coins and will speak to you with this passion. And you get to see the world through the eyes of somebody else in a way that can expand your own consciousness or way of looking at the world. So that's what I try to do with Stand Up by including a really diverse range of stories. The other, I was really forced into this position again because you can only write so much about coffee itself. And the reason why I think Stand Art continues to develop and sort of move forward on a nice trajectory is we really move through coffee as quickly as we can to get to the stories of the people behind the coffee, if that makes sense. And people are so unique and idiosyncratic and have so much experience and history to share that that's always rich. It always provides something new. And if you focus on that element of coffee culture, I mean, it's endless what you can cover.
Standards founder there, Michal Molkan, and editor-in-chief Luke Adams, speaking to me for last weekend's edition of The Stack. We're nearing the end of the show, but before we go, we have time for one final highlight. New words to appear in this year's Cambridge English Dictionary include delulu, meaning delusional, treadwife, a term coined by conservative influencers in the US, and skibbity, which appears to be a word used by most children under 11 and doesn't mean much at all. The Cambridge English Dictionary, which bills itself as the world's most popular online dictionary for users of English, says the new entrants must have staying power. But where do they fit? For Tuesday's edition of The Globalist, Emma Nelson delved into this question with a little help from a familiar voice.
Well, I'm joined down the line now by Monocle's Georgina Godwin, mistress of words, currently at the Edinburgh Festival. Very good morning to you, Georgina.
Hi, honey. It's good to speak to you.
Are you treadwife, delulu or skibbity this morning?
Oh, definitely Delulu. But here at the Edinburgh Festival, I've been here for the Literary Fest. And yesterday I heard Ali Smith speak. And she's got a new book called Glyph, G-L-I-F-F. And she says that it could mean a momentary resemblance, a sudden or chance view, an inkling, a wink of sleep, a mood someone's partner gets in when they miss their partner too much and get upset about it, a post-ejaculatory sex act, an organization that works for drug abuse prevention in Vienna, or to glimmer like sudden unanticipated light, or to dispel snow. So really, words are what you want them to be.
Just remind us of that word, because it might come in handy.
Absolutely, glyph. But, you know, she's not the only writer to do that. Shakespeare did it too. He invented or popularized hundreds of words like, say, eyeball, lonely, bedazzled, addiction, manager, swagger, eventful, belongings. Also phrases like brave new world, good riddance, green-eyed monster, wear your heart on your sleeve, the world's your oyster, and so on. And I think that when you look at that, when you look at the origin of language, a lot in English are colonial words, because English is a kind of alive Romance and Germanic bastard language, really. It takes in everything. And Borges said at the end of his life that he only wanted to write in English because it's like a palette with so many colors. So if you look at those words that have come in, so for instance, from Indian, curry, bandana, guru, pashmina, juggernaut, thug, pajamas, veranda, pundit, and then you have Swahili, safari, Boma, Hakuna Matata, of course. But the thing about English is that we don't, France has the Academy, which polices language. Of course, they're terribly strict, as you know, being absolutely fluent in French as you are, Emma. But English is not highly policed. But here's the interesting thing. It used to be. So for centuries, the British upper classes spoke Latin. And then after the Norman conquest, they spoke French. So that only happened. They only began speaking English in the 15th century. But the RP of BBC English wasn't an entirely organic development. It was shaped by an advisory committee on spoken English. And that was set up by the BBC's first head, John Reith, in 1926. It was chaired by George Bernard Shaw. And they had a subcommittee on words which fiercely debated challenges. For instance, the users of a television apparatus. So for TV, they wanted either aura-looker, glancer, looker-in, optoviewist, optovisor, seer, teleseer, teleserver, visionaire. The late entrant was televiewer. It was chosen and ultimately shortened. And then they had some that were ultimately rooted out, not for TV, but for other words, like, for instance, for art historian, they had Kunstforscher from the German for art researcher. They wanted mindful to replace brainwave, inflex for inferiority complex, and so on. And so, I mean, there's so much that this whole concept of new words is absolutely not a novel thing for us.
It's absolutely not, but we have but 30 seconds to work out whether these words are going to stick.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think I'd like to propose a new one. I mean, I like to call you and I broadcast bitches, but I think we could come up with some different names. Broadlasses, sound dames, audio bells. I don't know. But frankly, to me, it's all delulu.
It is, and I'm still feeling a bit skibbity.
Monocle's Emma Nelson and Georgina Godwin there. Well, that's all we've got time for this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by San Impi and presented by me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Join us again next week to hear some of the very best of the programs here on Monocle Radio. Thanks for listening.